Thank you both so much. That was lovely. You know, I have gotten various reactions when I've told people that I'm becoming a minister. But the one that sticks out in my mind, prepare yourselves, is the time I told someone, yes, I'm in seminary to become a minister, and they said, what denomination? And I said, Unitarian Universalist. And they replied, I guess it's easier to get ordained as a Unitarian. Now, the person meant well, I'm sure. But at the time, the remark cut so deep, my student loans shivered. It's a common misconception that ministers are immune to getting their feelings hurt and are perpetually gracious, or at least they should be. But again, I'm still a seminarian. And so I replied that actually, it would have been easier to become a Catholic priest. Which is not true, but I was angry. And I added, and this part is true, that a life of religious devotion is never easy. Perhaps sensing that I was personally offended, perhaps because I was, they changed course and walked it back and apologized, saying that they didn't mean anything about me, they only meant it because Unitarianism's a new thing, and that it might not be as hard as like a real religion. And again, I'm sure they meant well, but I did excommunicate them. Because they didn't know any better. It's an ongoing sore spot of mine, yes, that the history of Unitarianism and Universalism seems to have been largely forgotten in a country where at one time, Unitarianism and Universalism were the prevailing denominations in this country. If you lived in the US in the early 1800s and you went to church, there was a better than fair chance that you were one of us. In the Civil War, a large part of the chaplains, the military chaplains, were Unitarian chaplains. We used to represent the majority of chaplains in the US military. It was us. Globally, the history of this newfangled Unitarian thought goes back to the first time someone said that Jesus and God might be separate people. It goes back almost to the time of Jesus. And Universalist thought goes back even further. The first time someone came up with the concept of eternal damnation, someone nearby said, I don't think that sounds right. And that was the first Universalist. It was Thog, the caveman. So I wanted to say to this person, yes, you've probably heard that we are accepting of many viewpoints, but Unitarian Universalism is not a new faith. I wanted to say, yes, we're known for being flexible and embracing new and changing ways of thinking and worshiping, but we're not just making this up as we go along. I said none of those things because they had not asked for a sermon, but here you all are. And so I'll say them now. In one sense, this person was right. It is so easy to become a Unitarian Universalist. You can just walk in, the doors are open. But it's not necessarily easier to be a Unitarian Universalist. A life of religious devotion, except by accident or by default, a life of religious devotion chosen is never easy. So when I hear about Unitarian Universalism being a new religion, or the kind of religion where you can believe whatever pseudo-scientific, quasi-spiritual frivolity you feel like, I think back to Miguel Servetus, my historical boyfriend. Many of you have heard about Servetus from this very pulpit. Servetus was born in 1509. He was a theologian, a scientist, a physician, a cartographer. He believed in the unity of God, or the divine, if you will. He didn't call himself a Unitarian, in part because the word and the denomination did not exist before him. But his ideas played a major part in how we got here today. He believed in the freedom of one's own conscience in religion, which barely existed at the time and is still an inextricable part of our faith, arguably more than anti-Trinitarianism. We believe in the freedom of conscience, the individual search for truth and meaning. The fact that all are welcome here 500 years later is not something we made up in the 1960s while high. It's because Servetus championed religious tolerance. Now, Servetus was not a nobody at the time. He wasn't like posting random comments to YouTube. He became embroiled in a very public theological debate with none other than John Calvin, founder of Calvinism. And they wrote back and forth for years, which was a big mistake, because his letters wound up being used as evidence against him in a heresy trial. He was convicted in France. He escaped from prison, luckily, and after he escaped, they burned an effigy of him. That's a sign that you're in trouble. So Servetus went on the run. He was headed to Italy, where he could be reasonably assured of not being burned in effigy or otherwise. Now, Calvin had declared quite publicly that if Servetus, this anti-Trinitarian, this heretic, if he ever set foot in Geneva, he would not leave alive. Those were his words. So there was obviously no good reasons for Servetus to set foot in Geneva, having been told he would not leave alive. He was on the run to Italy when he received an invitation, just a friendly invitation from John Calvin, to come to Geneva for a friendly sort of theological debate. If you're thinking, that sounds like a trap, either you've heard how the story ends, or it's because it was absolutely a trap, and he died. It's a historical mystery to this day. Why Servetus stopped in Geneva? Why did he trust Calvin? It's so dumb. Scholars are still debating why. Nobody knows. He stopped in Geneva for a friendly debate with Calvin and got executed by being burned alive atop a pyre of his own books. Yeah, and it sounded wrong then too. While he was alive, it had been dangerous to publish these anti-Trinitarian writings, or anything that hinted at Unitarianism, because you could be burned alive. But once he was, his writings could be distributed far and wide with no repercussions, ironically, because he was already dead. And so they got distributed far and wide. The irony is that Servetus had nothing to lose at that point. No one else had to put their name on the line. He did it for them. And the widespread revulsion at his betrayal, which just seemed wrong to everyone, helped spread his writings even further as people said, yeah, but what did he do? Oh, this is what he did. You can read a pamphlet about it. The way he died just seemed wrong. He trusted Calvin. Now, our worship theme this month is trust. From one perspective, what makes the story of Servetus' death so incredible is that he trusted Calvin, and he was wrong. His trust was misplaced. Sometimes we wager on human goodness, and it comes back to bite us. It's really damaging. Religious people like to talk about trust and forgiveness as if we should all be doing these things all the time. And that's how religious people get exploited and walked over. Forgiveness is good for your soul, but let me tell you, some people should not be trusted. Someone still owes me money from 2004, and although I've forgiven them, I will not be lending them money again. Nor should you metaphorically stop in Geneva just because someone says you should trust them. But from another perspective, the real heart of the matter was not whether or not Servetus trusted Calvin. It's whether or not he trusted his own theology. I'd argue that that was the real wager. Because if Servetus' theology was wrong, the outcome was not just death now. It was eternal damnation. And if he convinced other people of a wrong theology and damned all of them to hell forever, man, the stakes were especially high. He had to be absolutely sure He had to trust what he was saying. This was not just an armchair intellectual exercise, like Heather McHugh sitting around in the square asking, what is poetry? Sometimes the stakes are real. If he was wrong in his criticism of biblical texts, if he was wrong that original sin is not real, if he was wrong about the Trinity not existing, in the eyes of most Christians at the time, there would be real and lasting consequences for his soul. The stakes were very high. He had to be sure. He could not do otherwise. Now, you've heard of Pascal's wager about believing in God, I hope, right? That you stand to gain more by believing and being wrong than by disbelieving and being wrong accidentally. But Pascal wouldn't formulate this wager for another 100 years. It was in effect. So how much did Servetus trust his takedown of Trinitarian Christianity? He staked his life on it. A life of religious devotion, chosen freely, is never easy. A few months ago, a man came into this very church, and some of you may remember this, and asked several people if they really thought this church would save them. And when I heard that this had happened, you can imagine, my first thought was, well, damn, I hope so. My student loans hope so. No, I'm no Servetus, but I have mortgaged the rest of my life in service to this faith, a faith that strangers occasionally tell me was only recently invented and is not real. You better believe I believe this church can save people. What are we doing here if we don't think this place can save people? 15 years after Servetus was executed, of Torta went into effect. Just 15 years later, and that was the first radical legal step towards religious freedom in the West. It's thanks to Servetus that my primary professional worry is the federal interest rate and not the Calvinist execution rate. Salvation is often assumed to be strictly about hell. Are we saved from a Christian hell? Unitarian Universalists don't even have a Christian hell. It's not an issue. If the gospel is good news, we have a gospel. We are the good news. We gather here 466 years after Servetus was executed in praise of the individual conscience in communal reverence, of that uniting sense of mystery, of wonder, of shared and universal being worthy of worship. We gather here in this life. We aren't waiting for the afterlife for our salvation. When I look around at society now, and I see the rising tide of dehumanizing, reductivist fundamentalism, that's a lot of big words and they're all bad. When I see the crushing evils of capitalism run amok, capitalism given free rein, profits over a permanently struggling underclass indentured to the excesses of the few. When I see such continual, institutional, standardized violence done to the oppressed and the suffering, so usual to us that it just seems the natural way of things. When I see that, the speculative possibility of hell is the least of my concerns. Do I think this church and this theology can save us? Hell yes. Yes. Rebecca Parker writes, salvation is fully arriving in this life, turning our faces toward its complex realities and engaging our whole being in creative, compassionate, loving interaction with what is at hand now. Salvation is the birth of full aliveness, the incarnation of divinity in the flesh of human life together. Salvation, she writes, is not something one possesses individually. It's not just your ticket to an afterlife and yours alone. She says it is something one participates in. Salvation is something one participates in communally, including in communion with those who have come before. We are saved by every person in every time who has stood up for what is true in spite of threat. Here is our good news. In a denomination where we get things wrong all the time, in a denomination that strives for justice while still living out white supremacy, almost casually sometimes, we're trying to get it right. I'm not interested anymore in pretending that this faith movement is just somehow incapable of perpetuating white supremacy because we mean well. I care too much to do otherwise. And a faith that claims to already have it right, the kind of faith that has it all figured out like Calvin did once and for all, that's not enough for me. It shouldn't be enough for reasoning, inquiring, dedicated religious people. A life of religious devotion is never easy, but it is worth it. So the issue is not whether I trust every individual Unitarian Universalist out there, or whether I should walk away when I feel like someone in this faith, in this church, or someone who works for the UUA has betrayed me. It's whether I trust in this 1,000-year project of ours. And I do. I cannot in good conscience say otherwise. Wherever there are oppressive ideas about what you need to believe in order to be saved, there will be a community of dissidents, a community of defectors who believe in a more inclusive and just way. Churches, customs, conventions, they are transient. But trust that as sure as we are still gathered here, 1,000 years from now, there will be people trying to do right. Amen. Blessed be.